And let's have a look at this developing story. You'll have heard Lisa mention this in the bulletin earlier, Mike Parry. Mohamed Al-Fayed has passed away at the age of 94.
Yeah.
A significant figure in business, former owner of Fulham FC, but perhaps most known, really, as the father of Dodi Fayed, killed in a car crash in Paris with Diana. Now, you're very close to this story.
Well, I broke the story to the world 17 minutes before the official announcement came out of the Elysee Palace, and it was the most nervous 17 minutes of my life.
Because it was a gamble, wasn't it, really?
Well, it wasn't a gamble. I had a correspondent with the Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, in Manila, OK? And he had been informed even before the Prime Minister, because it happened on foreign territory, and he was the Foreign Secretary. So he was the first member of the UK government to be informed that Diana had, in fact, died. And luckily, I had a man there, and he actually went up to Robin Cook and said, has Diana died? All the signs coming out of Paris. He said, I'm afraid I have to tell you she has. And so he came back to me. You can only rely on the reputation and the strength of your correspondence. I had to either say, we've got to go with it because the world needs to know this has happened, or I could have sat on it. I believed in the man who told me, Charlie Miller, the defence and diplomatic correspondent. We went with it. And can you imagine that news when Mohamed Al-Fayed, who had huge ambitions to become father-in-law to Diana, Princess of Wales, suddenly realised not only has his son gone, but the woman who he hoped would be his daughter-in-law had gone as well. It must have been enormous.
Correct. And he speculated, Emma, about the circumstances of that crash, and he implied and alleged at various intervals that this was planned.
Yeah, he did, and was, vilified by many in the British establishment for that. It's sort of end of an era, isn't it? I mean, just hearing Mike talk about that time and thinking back to Diana's death and all of that, it brings it all back quite vividly. And also listening to you guys talking about, his acquisition of Harrods and then Fulham Football Club and his real aspirations to be a figure in the British establishment.
And could never get a passport, could he?
No,
could never
was
get
never
a UK
acceptable.
Why was he
really
refused a passport by Jack Straw at the time? Do we know?
Well, because they always feared that in the background somewhere other information would come out, because nobody could ever discover where Mohamed Al-Fayed got his original money from to buy all these jewels like Harrods, like Fulham Football Club. Nobody knew where the source of his money. And he was an immensely rich man. Never mind Harrods. I think he had something like £30 million worth of apartments in Park Lane in the days when they only cost £1 million each. You know what I mean?
David.
Well, not only did he have that, he also bought and renovated the house that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. Yeah. And has turned it into a museum, which is supposed to be opening soon. He owned the Ritz in Paris. Yes. He bought Termal Nasser, the Prince of Wales' shirt maker, in order to get himself that bit closer. And can we just say, it was not Al-Fayed. That was a total fraud on his part. It was Mohamed Fayed. He decided to add the Al to make himself sound grander.
Oh, what's wrong with that?
Well, it's fraud. I mean, he was an extraordinary man, but I think also an extraordinarily bitter man. The years and years and years when he alleged, as you said, that there was the royal family playing a part in the death of...
Well, didn't he allege that
Prince
Philip killed his son?
Well, yes, he said it was a conspiracy between the late Duke of Edinburgh and the Security Service, which is just risible. Yeah. And he was clearly, if you lose your son and heir, you will be a deeply unhappy man. But I think it passed over from the realms of the normal grief and unhappiness to a serious...
Oh, he became deranged.
Yes, exactly.
He became deranged about it. He reckoned the Duke of Edinburgh's plan was to make sure that nobody except somebody with pure white skin would ever become a member of the royal family, and therefore his son was threatening the lineage of the royal family. He was convinced of it.
Yeah, so I worked for him because part of his plan to become a respectable figure of the establishment was to be the owner of a football club, and that was Fulham, and to be a media proprietor. So he set up 963 Liberty, a medium wave radio station based in London, actually run by Mike Hollingsworth, formerly of TVAM, very, very talented TV producer. And Al-Fayed was very focused about Mr. Fayed, very focused about what he wanted, a clear vision, pretty ruthless as well. Stories were legion at Harrods about how people would find out if they'd been fired. And very often it was the fact that their phone wouldn't work in the office. And they'd go off to HR and say, why doesn't my phone doesn't work? I can't get any calls through. And they go, oh, yeah, we need need to talk to you about that. You're being let go. There is another story in which he went walkabout in Harrods very regularly. He was the chairman and he was like the emperor of that place. And he'd go around to various departments making sure everyone was on their game. And in the menswear department, he caught a young retail professional swinging the lead, not being very busy. So he said, young man, go and do something, be useful, fold some jumpers, don't just stand there. So the person goes, yeah, apologies, Mr. Chairman, of course. And he gets busy, right, no problem. So then Al-Fayed walks off, but then he does a little swing round and goes back to the menswear department unexpectedly, and the young worker is again being lazy. And that was the last we saw of him.
I should think you would. I went to Fulham, his football club, one night when Everton were playing there, my club, OK, and the club had just been sold. He'd just sold the club, he'd got out of it. And I saw all these arc lights as I was leaving the stadium quite late on, because I'd been in the boardroom having plenty of this after the game. And do you know what it was? It was a crane had been moved in to remove the Michael Jackson statue, which he had erected at Fulham Football Club.
Because he was close to Michael Jackson.
Very close to Michael Jackson.
Let's have a look at what Fulham Football Club have had to say. Everyone at Fulham was incredibly saddened to learn of the death of our former owner and chairman, Mohamed Al-Fayed. We owe Mohamed a debt of gratitude for what he did for our club, and our thoughts are now with his family and friends at this sombre time. Was his input in Fulham, was his purchase of Fulham significant for Fulham's history?
It was very significant, but of course, when he first bought it, and think of the site of Fulham Football Club, right on the banks of the River Thames, prime, West London territory, everybody was convinced that he'd only bought it to knock it down and build multi-million pound flats on it. And yet, after he bought it, and he suddenly found that being the chairman of a Premier League football club actually makes you quite important, and you mix with the great and the good, and Bobby Charlton, where is Bobby Charlton? And all this kind of stuff. He suddenly decided he quite liked football. So he did the stadium up and kind of rebuilt it. Michael Cole, of course, our old friend, worked for him for many years, didn't he? As his
spokesman.
As his spokesman and information specialist. And in fact, I went to Fulham with Michael Cole and was in the director's box with Mr. Al-Fayed. One of Mr. Al-Fayed's sons was disabled, or is disabled,
right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And he was so caring about this boy to make sure that everybody made sure the lad, had his lunch properly and everything. I remember that distinctly. And he was a gigantic presence there, When you were his guest, you were like royalty as well, you know what I mean? I had a lot of time for him.